There are doors in this world that were meant to stay closed, not because of what lies behind them, but because of what closing them meant to those who turned the key one final time. Some doors hold secrets, others hold shame, and a few, just a few, hold both in equal measure, sealed away like a photograph too painful to look at but too important to destroy. This is the story of one such door. A door that remained locked for 60 years on a plantation in Louisiana, its key lost to time, its purpose forgotten by all but one. When it was finally opened on a humid September morning in 1927, what they found inside wasn't treasure or bodies or forbidden letters. What they found was evidence of something far more haunting. A life that stopped mid-sentence, a room frozen in time like a pocket watch that ceased ticking at the exact moment its owner's heart stopped beating. But to understand what that room meant, you have to go back. Back to when the door was still open, when the room still breathed with life, when the plantation house on Bayou Sorrel Road was home to the Beaumont family and the 43 souls who worked their land. Back to April 1865, when the world was ending and beginning at the same time. The Beaumont plantation sat like a wounded cathedral along the banks of Bayou Sorrel, 3 miles south of Plaquemine, Louisiana. From the river, you could see the house rising through the cypress trees. White columns that had started to lean slightly eastward, wide galleries with missing boards like gaps in a smile, and tall windows that reflected the water like tired eyes. The paint was peeling. The gardens had gone wild. Trumpet vines crawled up the pillars as if trying to pull the whole structure back down into the earth. War had left its mark on Louisiana like a boot print in soft mud, and the Beaumonts had felt it deeper than most. Charles Beaumont had returned from the conflict in March of 1865, 2 weeks before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. He'd left as a major, leading men he'd known since childhood into battles whose names he refused to speak. He'd returned as just Charles. No rank, no glory, no illusions left. He was 41 years old, with hair that had gone almost completely grey in 4 years, and the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was holding himself upright through sheer force of will rather than any actual strength. He'd lost weight. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and when he took it off that first night home, his wife Margaret had noticed the tremor in his hands as he unbuttoned the jacket. They'd been married 19 years, and she'd learned to read him like a barometer reads coming storms. What she saw in his eyes that night told her the man who'd left in 1861 hadn't really come back. Someone else was wearing his face. Margaret herself was 38, though she looked older. Managing a plantation during wartime had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. She'd been forced to make decisions she'd never been prepared for. Which workers to trust, which debts to pay first, how to stretch supplies that should have lasted a month into lasting 3. She'd sold family silver piece by piece, watched the fields yield less each year as equipment broke and couldn't be replaced, and lied to neighbors about how well they were managing when everyone could see the house falling apart around them. They had one child, Robert, now 17, who'd been 13 when his father left for war. He'd been too young to enlist, though he'd begged to lie about his age. Now he carried that missed opportunity like a wound, convinced he'd somehow failed a test of manhood he'd never been allowed to take. He was tall like his father, but hadn't yet grown into his height, all angles and awkward energy, with eyes that alternated between defiance and desperate need for approval. The war had changed him too, just in different ways. He'd watched his mother become hard. He'd learned that the world he'd been raised to inherit was built on sand. And he'd developed a cold pragmatism that sometimes frightened Margaret when she caught glimpses of it. The 43 people who remained on the land after emancipation stayed for various reasons, none of them simple. Some, like Sarah Hewitt, had nowhere else to go. She was 62, had been born in the quarters, and her arthritis made travel impossible. The proclamation had given her freedom, but freedom without resources is just a different kind of cage. She stayed because at least she knew this one. Others had family in the cemetery beyond the East Fields, 3 generations buried under the live oaks. their graves marked with wooden crosses and stones. James Pruitt had a wife and 2 children in that ground, taken by fever in 1859. He couldn't leave them. Wouldn't. A few stayed because they'd been promised wages that sometimes materialized and sometimes didn't. But at least there was a roof that mostly didn't leak and meals that were meager but regular. Moses Durant was one of these. Moses was 28, compact and watchful, with the kind of quiet intelligence that made people underestimate him right up until the moment they realized their mistake. His hands were scarred from years of working tobacco and indigo, thick calluses, old burns from the processing vats, a missing piece of his left thumb from a cutting accident when he was 14. He'd been born on the property, as had his father Philip before him. He'd learned to read in secret, taught by a minister who'd come through once and left behind a Bible with notes in the margins. After the proclamation, Charles Beaumont had offered Moses a position as foreman, a title that meant Moses was caught between 2 worlds, trusted by neither the workers he oversaw nor the family he reported to. He was supposed to organize labor, settle disputes, and serve as a buffer between the Beaumonts and everyone else. It paid slightly more than the other workers received, when payment came at all. Moses had taken the job because he understood leverage. As foreman, he had access to the main house, to conversations, to information, and information, he'd learned, was the only currency that couldn't be devalued by war. But there was one person on the plantation who existed in a category entirely separate from everyone else, floating above the normal hierarchies like smoke above a fire. Amélie. Amélie Laurent occupied a room on the 3rd floor of the main house, accessible only by a narrow servant staircase that wound up from the back of the house like a spiral shell. The staircase was steep, with worn treads that creaked in specific patterns. 3 steps up, silence, 2 more steps, a groan like a person sighing. People who used those stairs regularly learned to count the sounds without thinking, the way you learn the rhythm of your own breathing. The 3rd floor itself had been built as servant quarters originally, back when the house was new and the Beaumonts had a staff of 14 living upstairs. After the economy collapsed in the 1850s, most of those positions were eliminated. The rooms were converted, some to storage, some to nurseries for children who never materialized, one to a sewing room that Margaret had used before the war, when she'd still had time for such things. Amélie's room was at the end of the hall, under the peaked roof. It was small, maybe 12 feet by 14, with slanted ceilings and a single dormer window that faced east. From that window you could see over the live oak trees all the way to the bayou, and on clear mornings the water looked like hammered silver. No one could quite agree on when Amélie had arrived at the plantation. Charles claimed she'd been there since before the war, a distant cousin from New Orleans whose family had fallen on hard times during the Panic of 1857. He said she'd needed a place to stay and family was family, so they'd taken her in. His story was consistent but vague on details. He could never remember which side of the family she was related to, or what her maiden name had been, or exactly when she'd arrived. Before the war was as specific as he'd get. Margaret told a different story to the neighbors who still visited. She said Amélie was a war widow, a friend of the family whose husband had died at Shiloh. Out of Christian charity, they'd offered her refuge. In Margaret's version, Amélie was meant to be temporary, just until she recovered from her grief and could make arrangements to live elsewhere. But the war had dragged on, arrangements had become impossible, and somehow temporary had become permanent. Robert didn't talk about Amélie at all. When asked directly, he'd change the subject or claim he didn't remember much about her. But sometimes, late at night, the house servants reported seeing him standing at the bottom of the 3rd floor stairs, just staring upward at the darkness above, as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. Amélie herself seemed to exist outside of time and explanation. She was perhaps 35, perhaps 40. It was impossible to tell. She had that quality some women possess of being ageless. With dark hair she wore in a simple bun and pale skin that suggested she didn't spend much time in the Louisiana sun. Her eyes were gray, the color of river fog. And they had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was reading something written on your soul in a language only she could understand. She rarely came downstairs. In the early days, whenever those had been, she'd occasionally join the family for dinner, sitting quiet and still as a portrait while conversation flowed around her. But as the war progressed, those appearances became rarer. By 1864, she'd stopped coming down entirely. Delphine Carter, one of the house servants who'd chosen to stay on after emancipation, had taken on the task of bringing food to the third floor. Delphine was 43, thin as a rail fence, with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that knew when to stay shut. She'd been working in the Beaumont house since she was 12, and she understood its rhythms the way a sailor understands tides. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, which doors swelled in humidity, and which ones shrank. She knew where Margaret hid her laudanum and where Charles kept his whiskey. She knew Robert had a collection of drawings under his mattress that would horrify his mother. And she knew Amélie better than anyone else in the house, though better was relative. "That woman's got ghosts," Delphine told Moses one evening in May, about a month after Charles had returned from the war. They were in the kitchen house, Delphine preparing a dinner tray while Moses waited to discuss the week's work schedule with Charles. "I've been bringing her meals for near about 2 years now, and I ain't never seen her smile. Not once. Not even a little. Maybe she doesn't have much to smile about," Moses said, watching Delphine arrange bread and cold chicken on a plate. "None of us do, but we still manage sometimes." Delphine added a cup of tea to the tray, checking the temperature with her finger. "But Miss Amélie, she's different. Sometimes when I knock on her door, I hear her talking to herself. In French mostly, but sometimes English. Having whole conversations, asking questions and answering them like there's somebody else in there with her." "Maybe there is." Delphine cut her eyes at him. "Don't even joke about that. This house got enough troubles without adding Haints to the list." "What does she talk about?" "Can't always tell. My French ain't good enough to follow most of it. But I heard her say names sometimes, men's names mostly. And one time," Delphine lowered her voice, even though they were alone. "One time I heard her crying, just sobbing like her heart was broke clean in half, and she kept saying, 'I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry,' over and over, must have said it 100 times. Moses filed this information away in the careful mental catalog he kept of everything he observed. "She ever mention why she's sorry?" "If she did, she didn't tell me. But Moses, I'll tell you something strange. That woman's room is always locked. Always, from the inside. I knock, I wait, she unlocks it and opens it just wide enough to take the tray, then closes it and locks it again. Takes maybe 5 seconds total. And in those 5 seconds, I've tried to see into that room, but she keeps it dark. Curtains always drawn, even in daytime. What do you think she's doing in there?" Delphine shook her head slowly. "Nothing good, or everything good, depending on how you look at it. But whatever it is, she doesn't want anybody to see." Moses helped her carry the tray to the bottom of the servants' stairs. Delphine climbed with the practiced balance of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, not spilling a drop of tea despite the steep angle. Moses watched her disappear into the shadows above, then heard the pattern of her footsteps. 10 steps. Pause. 5 more steps. Stop. Then a soft knock. "Miss Amélie, got your dinner?" A long silence. Then the distinct sound of a lock turning, iron on iron. The creak of hinges. A murmur of voices too quiet to make out words. Another creak, and the lock again. Delphine descended with an empty tray. "She say anything?" Moses asked. "Just thank you. Same as always. But Moses, I saw something today I ain't seen before." "What?" "Her hands." When she reached for the tray, her hands were covered in ink. Black ink all over her fingers, smudged on her wrists, like she'd been writing for hours straight without stopping to wash. "Writing what?" "That," Delphine said grimly, "is the question, ain't it?" The trouble started 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in June when the heat lay over the plantation like a wool blanket soaked in water. Charles had been in his study going over the accounts, trying to reconcile the plantation's expenses with the meager income from their last indigo crop. The numbers didn't match. They hadn't matched for years. but he kept hoping that if he looked at them long enough, they'd somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. He'd been working with a leather-bound ledger, one of 3 he used to track different aspects of the plantation's finances. This particular ledger contained wage records. Who was being paid what? When payment was made? How much was still owed? It was a depressing document, full of debts that exceeded assets, promises that exceeded resources. Charles had set the ledger on the corner of his desk while he poured himself a drink, whiskey, warm, in a crystal glass that had somehow survived the war when so many other things hadn't. He'd stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the fields where workers were bent over the young indigo plants, their shapes wavering in the heat shimmer. When he turned back to his desk, the ledger was gone. He stared at the empty spot where it had been, his mind not quite accepting what his eyes were telling him. He checked the floor, thinking maybe it had fallen. Nothing. He checked the other papers on his desk, thinking maybe he'd absent-mindedly set it down somewhere else. It wasn't there. He searched his study methodically, the shelves, the other desk behind the furniture. He checked the library next door, then the parlor. The ledger had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. "Margaret," he called, his voice sharp with the edge of panic that comes when the world stops following its own rules. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been in the kitchen making preserves, and her face was flushed from the heat of the stove. "What's wrong?" "My ledger. The wage ledger. It's gone." "Gone?" "Charles, you must have misplaced it." "I didn't misplace it. It was here, on this desk, 30 seconds ago. I turned around, and when I turned back, it was gone." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to the careful patience she used when she thought he was being irrational. "Perhaps you left it upstairs, or in the library earlier." "I haven't been upstairs today, and I've already checked the library." He was moving through the room again, looking in the same places he'd already searched. Someone took it. Who would take a ledger? "The servants have been in the kitchen all afternoon. Robert's out riding. I've been right here and I didn't see anyone come or go." But even as she said it, they both thought of the same person. "Amélie," Charles said. Margaret's expression tightened. "Amélie hasn't been downstairs in months. Why would she suddenly decide to steal a ledger? I don't know. But she's the only person in this house who moves around like a ghost, appearing and disappearing. Who else could have taken it?" "Charles, you're being paranoid." "Am I? Think about it, Margaret. We don't really know anything about that woman. We don't know where she came from. We don't know why she's really here. We don't know what she does up in that room all day. She could be doing anything. She could be." He stopped, the thought too paranoid to speak aloud even in his current state, but Margaret understood. "You think she's spying on us? Charles, the war is over. Who would she even be spying for?" "I don't know. Maybe not spying. Maybe just gathering information. For purposes we don't understand." They stood in silence for a moment, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking loudly in the quiet room. Finally Margaret said, "I'll ask Delphine to inquire next time she brings up a meal." Gently. "We don't want to accuse her of anything." But that evening, when Charles went up to the 3rd floor himself, he found Amélie's door locked as always. He knocked, politely at first, then more insistently. "Amélie, I need to speak with you. A ledger has gone missing from my study, and I need to know if you've seen it." No answer. "Amélie, please. This is important. The ledger contains sensitive information about the plantation's finances. If you took it by accident, there's no harm done. Just return it and we'll say no more about it." Still no answer. He knocked harder, his knuckles starting to hurt against the solid oak. "Amélie, I know you're in there. I can see light under the door. Open up right now." Finally, a voice. Quiet, tired, but firm. "I haven't taken anything from you, Charles. I haven't been downstairs in months. Whatever you've lost, you'll have to find it yourself." "Then let me in. Let me see that you don't have it." "No." The flatness of that single word stopped him cold. There was no negotiation in it, no possibility of compromise. Just a simple, absolute refusal. "This is my house, Amélie. I have a right." You have many rights, Charles, but entering my room without permission isn't one of them. Not anymore. The world has changed, or haven't you noticed? He stood outside that door for 10 more minutes, alternating between demands and pleading, but the only response was silence. Eventually, he went back downstairs, his face dark with anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. The ledger reappeared 3 days later, tucked between 2 books in the library. Charles swore he'd checked that exact spot multiple times. Margaret suggested he'd simply overlooked it in his agitation. Robert said nothing but watched his father with an expression that might have been pity. And upstairs, in the locked room on the 3rd floor, lamplight burned long into the night. Moses first noticed something was wrong with the old overseer's cottage in early July. He'd been walking the property boundaries, checking fence lines and drainage ditches, when he'd passed the small building that sat about 100 yards from the main house, half hidden by a stand of magnolia trees. The cottage had been empty since Jack Winslow, the previous overseer, had left right after the war ended. Winslow had been a hard man with a taste for violence that even Charles had found excessive at times, though not excessive enough to fire him. When emancipation came, Winslow had packed his belongings and disappeared overnight, as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to leave. Good riddance, most people thought. The cottage had sat empty since then, slowly deteriorating. But as Moses walked past it that July morning, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He was certain it had been shut and locked the last time he'd checked, 2 weeks before. He approached carefully, scanning for signs of occupancy. The door hung crooked on its hinges, one of which had come loose from the frame. Inside, the cottage was dim and smelled of mildew and old tobacco. The furniture was still there. A narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wardrobe with its door hanging open. Dust lay thick on every surface, but someone had been inside recently. Moses could see footprints in the dust, small and neat, definitely not his own. They led from the door to the center of the room, then stopped at a spot near the hearth. Moses knelt down, examining the floor. The boards here were older than the rest of the cottage, probably salvaged from another building when this one was constructed. One of them looked loose. He worked his fingers into the gap and pried it up. Underneath was a space about 8 inches deep, running between the joists, and in that space was an oilcloth bundle. Moses lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than he expected, and when he unwrapped it, his hands started to shake. Papers. Dozens of them, maybe 100. Letters, journal pages, what looked like copied documents, all carefully organized and tied with string into categories. He didn't read them there. Some instinct told him this wasn't something to be examined in an abandoned cottage in broad daylight. Instead, he rewrapped the bundle, replaced the floorboard, and carried the oilcloth back to his own quarters. A small cabin he shared with James Pruitt and Samuel Price, 2 other workers who'd stayed on after emancipation. That night, after his roommates were asleep, Moses lit a candle and began to read. The first section contained letters. They were addressed to someone named Lieutenant Marcus Graves, Union Army, and they were signed A.L. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written by someone who had limited time and much to say. Moses read one dated May 1863. Lieutenant Graves, the shipment you inquired about will be moving south along the river road on the 15th of this month. 3 wagons, traveling at night to avoid detection. Destination is the Lemaire Plantation, approximately 12 miles south of here. Contents primarily medical supplies and ammunition, though I cannot verify exact quantities. I must stress again the danger of these communications. If discovered, the consequences would be severe not only for myself, but for others who have no part in this arrangement. I continue only because you've given me your word that this information serves a larger purpose than simple military advantage. Please destroy this letter after reading. A.L. Moses felt his heart hammering. This was intelligence gathering. Amelie, because who else could A.L.? Abby had been passing information to Union forces during the war. Information about Confederate supply movements, about plantations that were supporting the Southern cause, about people and resources and activities that Charles Beaumont and his neighbors would have considered treason. There were more than 20 such letters, spanning from 1862 to early 1865. They documented troop movements, supply caches, the locations of Confederate sympathizers, details about which plantations were hiding deserters and which ones were secretly trading with the North. The level of detail was remarkable. Amelie had clearly been paying close attention to everything that happened around her, recording conversations, observing patterns, gathering intelligence with methodical precision. But it was the second section of documents that made Moses's hands shake so badly he almost dropped the candle. These were journal pages, written in the same handwriting but in a different tone, more personal, more anguished. They documented the daily operations of the Beaumont plantation in ways that the official ledgers never would. Transactions that Charles had made during the war, using enslaved people as collateral for loans, as trade goods for supplies, as bargaining chips in deals that had nothing to do with agriculture and everything to do with survival. One entry from September 1863 read, "Today CB sold Philip Durant and his brother Marcus to a broker from Natchez. The sale was arranged in secret, recorded in a separate ledger that he keeps locked in his desk. The official record will show they ran away. The money from the sale went toward paying debts to suppliers in New Orleans, debts that CB incurred through gambling, not plantation business. Philip's son Moses, age 19, was not told. He believes his father chose to run north, seeking freedom. It's better if he continues to believe this. The truth would serve no purpose but to create pain. I watched the transaction from the upstairs window, watched Philip and Marcus loaded into the wagon, watched Moses working in the east field, unaware that his father was being taken away. I could have told him. I should have told him. But I am a coward, and cowards protect themselves first. Moses had to stop reading. He set the paper down, pressed his palms against his eyes, and tried to breathe through the rage that was building in his chest, like steam in a sealed kettle. His father hadn't run away. His father had been sold to cover Charles Beaumont's gambling debts while Moses had been working in the fields, believing that Philip had escaped to freedom somewhere in the north. For 7 years, he'd believed that lie. He forced himself to keep reading. There were more entries like that, documenting sales and trades and transactions that had been hidden from official records. People Moses had known, people he'd grown up with, worked beside, eaten meals with, all reduced to line items in a secret ledger of Charles Beaumont's financial desperation. But the third section was different. This was a list, 43 names, carefully written in alphabetical order. Each name had notes beside it. Durant, Philip, sold to broker from Natchez, Sept. 1863, current location unknown. Durant Marcus, sold to broker from Natchez, Sept. 1863, current location unknown. Hewitt, Sarah, retained on property, age 62, arthritic, unable to work full days. Pruitt James, retained on property, wife Catherine died 1859, fever. Children Anne and Thomas died 1859, fever. Carter Delphine, retained on property, house servant, literate. The list went on. 43 names, 43 histories compressed into brief notations. Some were marked sold, others died, a few escaped. The ones marked retained on property were the people still living and working at the plantation, the same people Moses saw every day. At the bottom of the list was a note in Amelie's handwriting. These are the people whose lives were controlled by the Beaumont family during the period of enslavement. This list is incomplete. There were others before my time here, and I do not have records of all transactions. But these 43 I have verified through direct observation, conversations, and examination of ledgers. I record their names so they will not be forgotten, so that when this system ends, and it must end because nothing this cruel can endure forever, there will be evidence of who they were, not property, not numbers in a ledger, people, with names and stories and families. I do not expect forgiveness for my complicity in their suffering. I lived in comfort while they suffered. I ate food they prepared, wore clothes they laundered, lived in a house they maintained. I cannot undo any of that, but I can do this one thing. I can make sure they are remembered, that their truth outlives our lies. Moses sat in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by these documents, and felt the world shifting beneath him. These papers were dangerous. Evidence of crimes, of moral failures, of a system that had operated through lies and violence and careful record-keeping. If Charles Beaumont knew these documents existed, he would destroy them. If the other plantation owners in the area knew, they would burn them. This was the truth they'd all agreed to hide. The reality they'd decided to forget, now that emancipation had made the past inconvenient. But Amelie had preserved it, documented it, created a record that couldn't be erased simply because it was uncomfortable. The question was, what should Moses do with it? Moses didn't sleep that night. He wrapped the documents back in their oilcloth and hid them under a loose board in his own cabin, a different hiding place, one he could access easily. Then he lay awake until dawn, thinking about his father, about lies and truth, about the weight of evidence. When morning came, he went through his work mechanically, assigning tasks to the other workers, checking on the indigo processing, discussing repairs with the carpenter. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities like someone examining a chessboard, trying to see 3 moves ahead. That evening, instead of going back to his cabin, he went to the main house. It was late, past 9 o'clock, and the family had finished dinner. Moses found Delphine in the kitchen house cleaning up. "I need to talk to Miss Amelie," he said without preamble. Delphine looked up from the pot she was scrubbing, her expression wary. "Mr. Charles don't like people going up there unannounced." "I'm not asking Mr. Charles. I'm asking you to help me talk to Miss Amelie." "About what?" Moses hesitated. Delphine had been at the plantation longer than he had. She knew its secrets, its hierarchies, its dangers. He could trust her, or at least he thought he could. But trust was a commodity in short supply on a plantation, even after emancipation. "About the truth," he said finally. "About things she's been writing down." Delphine set down the pot slowly. "You found something." It wasn't a question. Moses nodded. "Where?" "The old overseer's cottage, hidden under the floorboards." Delphine dried her hands on her apron, thinking. "Miss Amelie, she'd been writing things for years, ever since she came here. I used to see her sneaking into Mr. Charles's study late at night, copying things from his ledgers. I never said nothing because—" She trailed off. "Because why?" "Because sometimes the truth needs protecting more than the people who'd rather forget it." They stood in the warm kitchen house, moths batting against the windows, the smell of lye soap sharp in the air. "Can you take me to her?" Moses asked. "She don't let nobody in that room, not even me." "Then I'll talk to her through the door." Delphine considered this. Then she nodded. "All right. But if Mr. Charles catches you up there, I don't know nothing about it." They went through the main house quietly, Delphine leading the way with a candle. The servants' staircase was even darker at night, the narrow walls pressing close. Moses counted the steps without thinking. 3 steps, silence, 2 steps, groan. 10 steps total to reach the 3rd floor. The hallway was pitch black except for a thin line of light under Amelie's door. Delphine knocked softly. "Miss Amelie?" "It's Delphine. There's someone here wants to talk to you." A pause. Then Amelie's voice, muffled by the heavy door. "Who?" "Moses Durant." A longer pause. Moses heard movement inside the room. Footsteps, the scrape of furniture. "What does he want?" Amelie asked. Moses stepped closer to the door. "I found your documents, Miss Amelie. The ones you hid in the overseer's cottage. I read them." Absolute silence. Moses could almost feel the tension radiating through the wood. "I'm going to leave you two to talk," Delphine said quietly. She handed Moses the candle and disappeared back down the stairs, leaving him alone in the dark hallway. Moses sat down on the floor, his back against the wall opposite Amelie's door, the candle beside him. He waited. After several minutes, Amelie spoke. "How did you find them?" "I noticed the door was open. I went inside to check. The floorboard was loose. I meant to go back for them." Her voice was quiet, almost resigned. "I've been preparing, gathering everything I have into one place." "I must have forgotten about that bundle. Why were you gathering everything together?" "Because I'm running out of time." A creak. Amelie sitting down on the other side of the door, mirroring his position. "Because I know what's coming. Charles suspects I've been documenting things. He's been watching me, even though he pretends he isn't. Eventually he'll try to get into this room. When he does, I need to be ready. Ready how? Ready to protect what matters." Moses thought about the documents he'd read, about his father's name on that list, about all the truth compressed into those pages. Why did you do it? Why spend years writing all of that down, hiding it away? Because someone had to. Amelie's voice was soft but certain. Everyone else was so busy participating, so caught up in the daily machinery of it all, that nobody was stepping back and seeing it clearly. Or if they saw it, they justified it. They told themselves stories about duty and tradition and the natural order of things. But she paused. "I couldn't make myself believe those stories. I tried. God knows I tried. But every time I looked at what was happening around me, all I could see was the truth underneath the justifications." "So you wrote it down." "I wrote it down. Not for now. I knew it couldn't help anyone now. But for later. For when enough time had passed that people could look at it without needing to defend themselves. For when the truth could teach instead of just accusing." Moses watched the candle flame dance, casting shadows that climbed the walls. "There are things in those documents that could hurt people. Charles Beaumont, other plantation owners, they document crimes. I know. If those documents became public, people would face consequences, maybe even prosecution. I know that too. Is that what you want? Revenge?" "No." The word was immediate and firm. "I don't want revenge. I want truth. There's a difference. Revenge is about making people suffer because they made others suffer. Truth is about making sure what happened isn't forgotten or rewritten into something more comfortable." "And my father?" Moses's voice cracked slightly. "You wrote that he was sold, not that he ran away. I spent 7 years thinking he'd escaped to freedom, thinking he'd made it out. And all this time, he was sold to cover gambling debts." "I'm sorry you had to learn that way." Amelie's voice was gentle. "I debated telling you so many times. But I was afraid of what that knowledge would do to you, afraid you'd do something rash that would get you hurt or killed. So I kept silent. I'm not proud of that choice, but I made it." Moses pressed his palms against his eyes. "Do you know where he is? Where they took him?" "No. The broker was from Natchez, but that doesn't mean that's where he ended up. He could be anywhere in the South by now, if he's still alive." The "if" hung in the air between them like smoke. "I have those documents now," Moses said after a long silence. "I could burn them, destroy all the evidence and let the past stay buried. That's what most people would want." "Yes. Or I could keep them, use them, show people what really happened here." "You could. What do you think I should do?" Amelie was quiet for so long that Moses thought maybe she wouldn't answer. Then, "I think you should do whatever lets you live with yourself. I've spent years gathering that evidence, and what has it gotten me? I'm locked in a room, cut off from the world, carrying the weight of all those stories. Sometimes I think I should have burned it all years ago. Other times I think it's the only thing I've done that matters." That's not an answer. No, but it's the truth. I can't tell you what to do with what you know, Moses. That's a decision you have to make for yourself. All I can tell you is this. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. It changes you, and you have to decide whether you want to carry that change or try to bury it. Moses thought about his father, about the 43 names on that list, about Charles Beaumont sitting in his study, drinking whiskey and pretending the past had never happened. "I'm not going to burn them," he said finally. "No, I didn't think you would. But I'm not going to make them public either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Then what will you do?" "I don't know yet. But I need you to tell me everything. Not just what's in those documents, but everything else you've gathered, everything you have in that room. Because if we're going to protect this truth, I need to know exactly what we're protecting." Another long silence. Then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened, just a crack. Through the gap, Moses could see Amelie's face in lamplight, pale, exhausted, but with eyes that burned with a fierce intelligence. "All right," she said, "come in." "But Moses, once you see what's in here, you can't unsee it. Are you certain you want that?" Moses stood up, picked up his candle, and stepped toward the door. "I'm certain." The room was smaller than Moses had imagined, and more crowded. Every surface was covered with papers, stacked on the desk, the dresser, the narrow bed. They were organized into piles, each one labeled with careful handwriting. The curtains were drawn tight over the single window, and the air smelled of ink and old paper and lamp oil. Amelie stood in the center of the room, wearing a simple dress that looked like she'd slept in it. Her hair was falling out of its bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "This is everything I've gathered," she said, gesturing at the papers. 7 years of documentation, letters, journal entries, copied ledgers, testimonies from workers when they were willing to talk to me, all of it organized by category and date. Moses set down his candle and began examining the piles. Each one was meticulously labeled. Plantation operations, 1858-1865. Sales and transactions, 1860-1865. Correspondence, C. Beaumont. Correspondence, other plantation owners. Personal testimonies. Intelligence reports to Union forces, 1862-1865. Financial records, gambling debts. Medical records, injuries and deaths. He picked up a page from the medical records pile. It was a list of people who'd been injured or died on the plantation between 1860 and 1865, with notes about causes. Catherine Pruitt died August 1859, fever. No doctor called, family was told medical care too expensive. Samuel Wright, injured. June 1862, accident with processing equipment, lost 3 fingers on right hand, received no compensation. Eliza Fenton, died in childbirth, March 1863, baby also died, no midwife present despite multiple requests. The list went on. 23 deaths in 5 years, most of them preventable with basic medical care that had been denied. "How did you get all of this?" Moses asked, his voice rough. "I listened, I watched. I copied things from Charles's study when he was drunk or away. I talked to workers when I could do it without arousing suspicion, though I could never talk to them as honestly as I wanted to. They didn't trust me, and they were right not to. I was part of the system that oppressed them, even if I was documenting it." Amelie sat down on the edge of her bed, suddenly looking exhausted. "I had freedom of movement in this house that others didn't. I used it." "And the intelligence reports? You really were passing information to the Union?" "Yes. I made contact with a Union officer in 1862, through a friend in New Orleans who knew I disagreed with the Confederate cause. Lieutenant Graves was running an intelligence operation, trying to track Confederate supply lines and sympathizer networks. I provided what I could. Locations, movements, plans I overheard." She looked directly at Moses. "I justified it by telling myself I was helping end the war faster, that if the Union won quickly, fewer people would die. But I don't know if that's really why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to feel like I was doing something, anything other than being complicit." Moses moved to another pile, the personal testimonies. These were pages of handwritten accounts, dated and signed with names he recognized. Testimony of Delphine Carter, recorded April 1864. "I've been working in the Beaumont house since I was 12 years old. I seen things I ain't supposed to talk about. Seen Mr. Charles bring women who wasn't his wife to the house when Miss Margaret was away. Seen him beat workers for things that wasn't their fault. Seen him sell people to pay for his drinking and gambling, then lie about where they went. I kept quiet because that's what you do when you got no power. But Miss Amelie, she asked me to tell the truth, and I'm telling it. Let somebody know what really happened here. Delphine knows about this? Moses looked up sharply. She's known from the beginning. She's the one who helped me access parts of the house I couldn't get to on my own. She's the one who told me stories about what happened before I arrived. Amelie's voice softened. She's been protecting me, making sure I could do this work safely. Moses felt his understanding of the plantation shifting again. How many other people knew about this? How many had been quietly participating in this documentation while he'd been unaware? He picked up another testimony, this one from someone named Ruth Willis, dated 1863. They took my boy in the night, said he'd been stealing food, which was a lie. He was hungry, like we all was hungry, but he never took nothing that wasn't his. They sold him anyway. Sold him to a man from Alabama, and I ain't never seen him since. He was 9 years old. His name was Thomas. I'm saying his name here so somebody remembers. Thomas Willis, my son, 9 years old when they took him. Moses had to stop reading. His hands were shaking. There are 47 testimonies in total, Amelie said quietly. Not everyone would talk to me. Some were too afraid. Others they'd been through too much to want to relive it by telling stories to a white woman who lived in the main house. I don't blame them for not trusting me. But the ones who did talk, I wrote down their words as exactly as I could. Their truth, in their voices. Moses looked around the room at all these papers, all this carefully preserved evidence, years of work, years of risk, all hidden away in a locked room on the 3rd floor of a house that would rather forget. What were you planning to do with all of this? He asked. Amelie stood up and walked to the window, though she didn't open the curtains. I don't know. I still don't know. In the beginning I thought maybe I'd give it all to the Union Army, let them use it for reconstruction efforts. But the war ended, and Reconstruction became its own kind of war, and I realized that releasing this information right now would just cause more violence. The people named in these documents, they'd be attacked. Their families would be threatened. It wouldn't lead to justice, it would just lead to more suffering. So you locked yourself in here. So I locked myself in here. To protect the evidence until I don't know what. Until enough time has passed that the truth can exist without destroying the people it's supposed to help. But I don't know how much time that is. 10 years? 20? 50? 60? Moses said, surprising himself. Amelie turned to look at him. What? 60 years. That's how long it would take for everyone who's alive now to be dead. Everyone who could be hurt by this information, everyone who could use it as a weapon, everyone who has a stake in keeping it hidden. 60 years and this becomes history instead of current events. Amelie considered this. 60 years. I'd be 90-something if I lived that long, which I won't. None of us will, that's the point. This information protects people who are alive now by staying hidden. But in 60 years, it protects their memory by being revealed. They stood in silence, surrounded by 7 years of documented truth. There's a problem, Amelie said finally. Charles knows I have something. He doesn't know what exactly, but he suspects. And he's not gonna let me just stay locked in this room indefinitely. Eventually he'll force the door. He'll destroy everything I've gathered. Not if we make it too dangerous for him to try. What do you mean? Moses picked up one of the piles, the financial records showing Charles's gambling debts and illegal transactions. These are the ones that would hurt him most, right? If these became public, he'd face legal consequences, maybe even criminal charges. Yes, but... So we let him know we have copies, hidden somewhere he can't find them. And if he tries to force his way into this room, those copies go to newspapers, to courts, to anyone who'll listen. Mutually assured destruction. Amelie's eyes widened. Moses, that would make you a target. Charles would have to be very careful about what he did to me, knowing that my death or disappearance would trigger exactly what he's trying to prevent. Moses met her gaze steadily. I'm not saying it's safe. I'm saying it's leverage. And right now, leverage is the only thing that protects any of us. You do that? Put yourself at risk to protect these documents? My father's name is in these documents. His story. The truth about what happened to him. Yes, I'll protect that. I'll protect all of it. Amélie nodded slowly. Then we need to make copies. Of the most damaging material at least, and we need to hide them somewhere absolutely secure. They worked through the night. Amélie showed Moses which documents would be most damaging to Charles if revealed. The gambling debts, the illegal sales, the falsified records. Moses copied them by hand, his fingers cramping from the unfamiliar work of extended writing, but he pushed through. By dawn, they had a complete duplicate set of the most critical evidence. Moses wrapped these copies in fresh oilcloth and took them with him when he left, climbing down the servants' stairs as the sun rose over the bayou. Delphine was in the kitchen house, starting breakfast. She looked up when Moses entered, saw his expression, and simply nodded. "You saw it all," she said, not a question. "I saw it all. And we're going to protect it, all of us. For as long as it takes." Delphine poured him coffee, strong and bitter. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep doing what you've been doing. Take care of Miss Amélie. Watch and listen. And if Charles tries to force that door, you come find me immediately." "And then what?" "Then we make sure he knows the cost of trying to bury the truth." 2 days later, Moses stood in Charles Beaumont's study, the oilcloth bundle on the desk between them. Charles looked at the bundle, then at Moses, his face carefully neutral. "What is this?" "Evidence," Moses said simply, "of transactions you made during the war. Sales, trades, falsified records, gambling debts paid with human lives." Charles's face went white, then red. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter? What matters is that I have them. And I have copies, hidden where you'll never find them. And if anything happens to me, those copies get delivered to people who would be very interested in what they contain." "You're threatening me." Charles's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm protecting myself and others. There's a difference." "Do you have any idea what you're playing with, Moses? These documents, if they became public, would destroy more than just me. They'd hurt the workers, the plantation, everyone who depends on lies." Moses cut him off. "Everyone who depends on pretending the past didn't happen? Maybe it's time to stop protecting those lies." Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "I could have you arrested, accuse you of theft, of extortion. You could try. But the moment you do, those copies start moving. Newspapers in New Orleans, federal authorities in Baton Rouge, church leaders, northern investors who might be interested in knowing exactly what kind of man they're doing business with." They stared at each other across the desk, the bundle of papers sitting between them like a lit fuse. "What do you want?" Charles asked finally. "I want the truth to be protected. Miss Amélie has been gathering evidence in that room upstairs. Evidence of what really happened on this plantation. She's going to continue that work, undisturbed. Nobody forces her door. Nobody threatens her. Nobody tries to destroy what she's built. In exchange, the most damaging evidence about your personal conduct stays hidden. For how long? For as long as it takes. Until everyone who could be hurt by its release is dead and gone. That could be decades." "Yes." Charles sat back down slowly, his face aged by the weight of this new reality. "And if I refuse, then we all burn together. You, me, everyone. The truth comes out, and we all face the consequences. Is that what you want?" A long, terrible silence. "No," Charles said finally. "That's not what I want." "Then we have an agreement?" Charles's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "What about wages for the workers who stayed?" "Fair wages, paid on time, no more delays, no more promises that don't materialize. That's extortion. That's justice. You don't get to use people anymore without paying them what they're worth." Another silence. Then Charles extended his hand across the desk, his expression one of barely controlled rage mixed with grudging respect. "Fine. You have your agreement. But Moses, if you ever cross me, if those documents ever see daylight during my lifetime, I will make you regret it." Moses shook his hand, feeling the tremor in Charles's grip. Anger or fear, impossible to tell which. "I believe you, just like you should believe me when I say I'll do exactly what I've promised if you force my hand." They released hands and Moses picked up the bundle of documents. "I'm keeping these, as a reminder of our agreement." He left the study without waiting for a response. Behind him, he heard the sound of a glass being poured, then the clink of it being set down hard on the desk. The summer of 1865 gave way to fall, and the locked room on the third floor remained undisturbed. Delphine continued bringing meals to the bottom of the servants' stairs. The food always disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, other workers reported seeing lamplight in Amelie's window. Once, Sarah Hewitt, whose cabin was closest to the main house, swore she heard someone singing, a French lullaby, sad and sweet. Moses kept the duplicate documents hidden in a new location, buried in a waterproof box beneath a marked stone in the Plantation cemetery. He checked on them once a week, making sure they were safe and dry. The weight of carrying that secret changed him in ways he couldn't quite name. He became quieter, more watchful, but he also became more assertive with Charles, more willing to push back when workers weren't paid on time or conditions weren't adequate. Charles honored their agreement, though he did it with visible resentment. Wages were paid, if not always generously. Conditions improved, if not always quickly. The plantation limped along, never quite prosperous but no longer on the edge of collapse. Margaret noticed the change in the dynamic between her husband and Moses, but she never asked about it directly. Some truths she'd learned were safer left unspoken. Robert, now 18, began helping with the plantation management. He had his father's talent for numbers but lacked his capacity for self-deception. He saw the financial reality clearly. The plantation was dying slowly, strangled by debts and the changing economy. He started making plans to sell portions of the land, to modernize operations, to find a way forward that didn't depend on pretending the past hadn't happened. And in the third-floor room, Amélie continued her work. Moses visited her twice more that fall, climbing the servants' stairs late at night to sit on the floor outside her door and talk through the oak barrier. "I've been writing my own account," she told him in October. "Not just documenting what others did, but what I did. My complicity, my choices, my failures. If this archive is going to be honest, it needs to include my part in it too." "What will you do with all of it?" Moses asked. "Eventually, I mean." "I don't know. I suppose I'll die in here and then it will be up to you. Up to whoever's left. You can open the door and destroy everything, or you can seal it permanently, let it become a tomb for the truth, or you can wait until enough time has passed that opening it won't hurt anyone anymore. How will I know when that is? You won't. But you'll make the best choice you can with the information you have. That's all any of us can do." In November, Father Benedict returned to the plantation. Margaret had sent for him again, worried about Amélie's continued isolation. The priest climbed the servants' stairs and knocked on the locked door. "Miss Amélie, it's Father Benedict. I've come to check on you as I promised." "I'm well, Father, thank you for your concern. Your body may be well, but I worry about your soul. This isolation, this locked room, it isn't healthy. It isn't natural. Neither was what happened on this plantation for generations. Sometimes the only sane response to an insane world is to remove yourself from it." Father Benedict tried reasoning with her, pleading with her, even threatening her with spiritual consequences if she continued refusing help. But Amélie remained firm. The door stayed locked. When the priest came back downstairs, he told Margaret, "I've done all I can. She's made her choice. You can force the door if you wish, but I suspect that would only make things worse. And if she dies in there, then she dies having made her own decision, which is more than many people get. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people carry their burdens in their own way." Margaret didn't find this particularly comforting, but she let the matter drop. The winter was hard that year. Cold rain fell for weeks, turning the fields to mud and the roads to rivers. The plantation workers huddled in their cabins, burning what wood they could gather, waiting for spring. In the main house, the Beaumonts tried to maintain normalcy. They hosted one Christmas dinner for neighbors, a subdued affair where everyone drank too much and talked about anything except the war. Robert announced his intention to attend university in New Orleans, which pleased Margaret and worried Charles. Worried because university was expensive and they barely had enough money to keep the plantation running. And upstairs, Amelie's light burned through the winter nights. Delphine began to notice changes in the food trays. Amelie was eating less. The portions she took were smaller, and sometimes entire meals came back untouched. When Delphine knocked and asked if everything was all right, Amelie always said yes, but her voice sounded weaker. In February, Delphine told Moses, "I think she's sick. Really sick. She won't say so, but I can hear it in her voice. Have you told Margaret? Maybe we could get a doctor. She won't let anybody in." I asked. She said if she's sick, it's her choice to deal with it her own way. Moses climbed the stairs that night and knocked on Amelie's door. "Miss Amelie, it's Moses. Delphine says you're not eating. Are you ill?" A long pause. Then, "I'm tired, Moses, just tired." "Tired like you need rest or tired like something else? Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters. If you're sick, we can get you help." "I don't want help. I want..." She trailed off. "I want this to be over. I want to have finished what I started. And I'm close. So close. Just a few more months of work, and the archive will be complete. Everything documented, everything organized, everything ready. Ready for what? For whoever opens this door next, whenever that is." Moses pressed his palm against the door, wishing he could see her face. "Don't give up. Not now. I'm not giving up. I'm finishing. There's a difference." But over the next weeks, it became clear that something was wrong. The food trays came back barely touched. The light in her window burned at odd hours, as if she was sleeping during the day and working through the night. Once, Delphine heard her coughing, deep, rattling coughs that sounded like something breaking inside. In early April, the food stopped disappearing entirely. For 2 days, the tray Delphine left at the bottom of the stairs sat untouched. On the 3rd day, Moses went up and knocked. "Miss Amelie?" No answer. He knocked harder. "Miss Amelie, if you can hear me, please make a sound." Silence. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. No movement, no breathing, no sound at all except the slight creak of the house settling. "Delphine, go get Mr. Charles," Moses said quietly. When Charles arrived with a crowbar, Moses stopped him. "Wait. We had an agreement. The room stays sealed. There's a woman dead in there. Maybe. Probably. But that doesn't change what we agreed. She wanted this room kept locked. She told me that specifically. Said that when she died, the door should stay sealed until enough time had passed. That's insane. That was her wish. And if you force that door, our agreement is void. Everything gets released." Charles' face went through a series of expressions: rage, grief, frustration, and finally, resignation. He lowered the crowbar. "Fine. We seal it. But I want it sealed properly. I want that door locked from out here, boarded up, made inaccessible. I want it to be like that room never existed." "Why?" Moses asked, genuinely curious. "Because I don't want to think about it. I don't want to walk past that door every day and wonder what's in there. I don't want Robert or anyone else getting curious and trying to open it. I want it gone." So that's what they did. Moses personally oversaw the sealing. First, they locked the door from the outside. Charles had a spare key that he'd kept for years. Then Moses nailed heavy boards across the doorframe, multiple layers, making it impossible to open without major demolition. Then they called in a carpenter, a man named Robert Wells, who'd done work on the plantation for decades. "I need you to build a false wall," Charles told him. "Right here in front of this door. Make it look like the hallway just naturally ends a few feet shorter. Nobody should be able to tell there was ever a door here." Wells, who understood that sometimes the best way to keep a job was not to ask questions, simply nodded and got to work. It took him 3 days. When he was finished, the hallway was shorter by about 8 feet. A landscape painting hung on the new wall, a scene of the bayou at sunset, painted by Margaret's sister years before. It looked completely natural, like the hallway had always ended exactly there. The room, and whatever was inside it, was sealed away. Charles paid Wells generously for his discretion. Then he had a gravestone placed in the family cemetery with Amelie's name and the dates 1830-1867, both of which were guesses since nobody knew exactly when she'd been born. The grave beneath the stone was empty. After Amelie's room was sealed, life on the plantation continued in that stumbling, improvised way that life has of continuing, even after everything seems to have ended. Charles died in 1879 at age 55 of a heart condition that his doctor said was probably hastened by years of stress and drinking. His last words to Robert, delivered from his deathbed, were, "Don't ever open that room. Whatever you do, don't open it." Robert, who'd been managing the plantation for several years by then, and had his own suspicions about what his father might have hidden, simply nodded. "I won't." Margaret lived until 1885, outliving her husband by 6 years. She spent her final years in a kind of willful amnesia, talking about the plantation as if its glory days had been real rather than built on suffering. When she died, Robert found her diary in her bedroom. The entries from the years 1865-1867 had been torn out, leaving a gap in the record that could never be filled. Robert inherited the property and immediately began making changes. He sold off portions of the land, 200 acres to a timber company, another 100 to a neighbor who wanted to expand his holdings. He modernized what remained, invested in better equipment, treated the workers who stayed on with something approaching respect rather than resentment. He never married, never had children. When people asked why, he'd shrug and say he didn't think it was fair to bring children into a world built on the kind of foundations the plantation had. He never opened the third-floor room, never even went up to the third floor if he could avoid it. Moses stayed on the plantation until 1901. By then he was 64 years old, one of the longest-serving workers in the parish. He'd saved enough money, real money, actually paid, actually earned, to retire comfortably. His daughter Grace, who'd been born in 1870 to a woman Moses had married and lost to fever 3 years later, was living in New Orleans with her own family. Before he left, Moses did several things. First, he dug up the box from the cemetery that contained the duplicate documents. He examined them carefully. They'd survived the decades remarkably well, protected by the waterproof container. He considered destroying them. Nobody was left alive who'd be directly threatened by their revelation. Charles was dead. Most of the people named in the documents were dead, but he remembered Amelie's words about truth needing to outlive lies. And he remembered his father, sold to cover gambling debts, dying God knew where, his story erased from the official record. So he kept the documents. Second, he wrote a detailed letter explaining everything: the sealed room, what it contained, why it had been sealed, what should be done with it. He wrote about Amélie, about her years of documentation, about the archive she'd built. He wrote about the agreement he'd made with Charles, about the duplicate documents, about the truth that had been preserved. At the end of the letter he wrote, "I don't know when this room should be opened. Maybe never. Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50. That's not for me to decide anymore. But whoever does decide, whenever that is, they should understand what they're opening. Not just a room, a witness, a testament. A truth that somebody cared enough about to protect with her life. Do with it what you think is right, but don't pretend it doesn't matter. It mattered enough for Miss Amélie to lock herself away. It mattered enough for me to spend decades protecting it. It should matter enough for whoever comes next to at least consider what it means." Moses Durant, October 1901. He sealed this letter in wax, wrote on the envelope, "To be opened only when the third-floor room is unsealed, not before 1925, and took it to the parish clerk in Plaquemine, a young man named Martin Boudreau, who'd recently taken over the position. "I need you to hold this in trust," Moses explained. It's not to be opened until at least 1925, and only if the room it references is opened. If that room stays sealed, this letter stays sealed too. Boudreau, intrigued but professional, agreed. He filed the letter in a special archive the parish kept for such requests and gave Moses a receipt. "You really think this letter will matter in 24 years?" Boudreau asked. "I think the truth always matters," Moses said, "even when it takes decades to surface." Then Moses Durant left Louisiana for the last time. He took a train to New Orleans, moved in with his daughter, and spent his remaining years telling his grandchildren stories about their great-grandfather Philip. Stories that were mostly true, now that he knew what had really happened. He died in 1913, at age 76, having never revealed publicly what was sealed in that third-floor room. The years rolled on, as years do, indifferent to human drama. Robert Beaumont managed the plantation until 1919, when he sold everything to an agricultural corporation based in Baton Rouge. He was 71 by then, tired of the responsibility, tired of maintaining a property that had been bleeding money for decades despite his best efforts. The corporation tried to make a go of it for a few years, but the economics of large-scale plantations had fundamentally changed. Labor was expensive now. Equipment was expensive. Competition from western states with better soil and climate made it hard to profit from traditional crops. In 1923, they sold the land to a timber company. The timber company harvested what valuable trees remained, then sat on the property for several years, trying to decide what to do with it. The land was valuable. The house was a liability, old, deteriorating, expensive to maintain. In 1927, they made the decision to demolish the main house and sell the land in parcels. They hired a salvage company to strip anything valuable from the house before demolition: copper pipes, wood paneling, brass fixtures, anything that could be resold. The salvage crew was given 2 weeks to work before the demolition team arrived. Tommy Reeves was 19 years old, broad-shouldered and perpetually cheerful. The kind of young man who found adventure in everything, even in tearing down old houses. He'd been working for Southern Salvage Company for 8 months, and he loved the work, never knowing what you'd find in these old places, the physical challenge of dismantling structures, the camaraderie of the crew. The Beaumont house was their biggest job yet. 3 stories, 14 rooms, enough salvageable material to keep them busy for weeks if the timeline allowed it. On September 14th, Tommy was assigned to check the 3rd floor for copper piping. The company owner, Mr. Guidry, had said there should be plumbing up there, remnants of an old bathroom installation that had never been completed. Tommy climbed the narrow servant's staircase, 3 steps, silence, 2 steps, groan, counting without thinking, the way people do with familiar rhythms. The 3rd floor was dim and close, with slanted ceilings and the smell of dust and old wood. There were 3 rooms visible, 2 small ones that had been bedrooms, now empty except for broken furniture, and 1 larger space that might have been a sitting room. Tommy checked all 3 for pipes, found some, marked them for removal, made notes on his clipboard. But something was bothering him about the hallway. It felt wrong somehow. He walked its length, measuring with his tape measure. The hallway, according to his measurements, should have been about 22 feet long, but his tape only showed 14 feet from the stairwell to the wall. 8 feet were missing. Tommy knocked on the end wall experimentally. Hollow. Definitely hollow. "Hey, Mr. Guidry," he called down the stairs. "I think there's a room behind this wall up here." It took the crew 2 hours to break through. First, they removed the painting, the landscape of the bayou, its colors faded after 60 years. Then they attacked the false wall with crowbars and hammers, pulling away boards that had been professionally installed, but were now brittle with age. Behind the false wall they found more boards, thick ones, nailed directly into the door frame, multiple layers deep. "Somebody really didn't want this opened," Guidry muttered, prying away another board. Finally they reached the door itself, heavy oak, solid, with a lock that had rusted in place. It took another hour to force the lock, when it finally gave way with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed with decades of disuse. Air rushed out, stale, dry, smelling of paper and time and something else they couldn't quite identify. Death, maybe, though there was no body. Tommy was the first one through the door, holding an electric torch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a room exactly as it had been left 60 years before. A narrow bed, made but never slept in again. A dresser with a brush still on top of it, hair still caught in the bristles. A wardrobe with dresses hanging inside, styles from the 1860s, faded and moth-eaten. And papers. God, so many papers. They covered every surface, the desk, the floor, the bed, boxes stacked in corners. All of them carefully organized, labeled, dated. Decades of documentation, preserved in the dry, sealed room like artifacts in a tomb. What the hell is all this? Guidry breathed, picking up a page from the nearest pile. Tommy had found something on the desk. A letter addressed to whoever opens this door. He picked it up carefully, the paper brittle with age but still readable. His lips moved as he read, his expression changing from curiosity to shock to something like awe. "Boss," he said quietly, "you need to read this, all of it. This isn't just some old papers. This is history. Real history. The kind nobody talks about." They spent the rest of that day in the room, reading by torchlight, trying to understand the scope of what they'd found. Journal entries detailing plantation operations, letters documenting intelligence passed to Union forces during the war, financial records showing illegal transactions, testimonies from enslaved workers, their voices preserved in careful handwriting. And at the center of it all, Amelie's own account, hundreds of pages documenting her years of gathering evidence, her reasons for doing it, her guilt and complicity and desperate hope that the truth would matter. "We need to stop the demolition," Tommy said, as the sun set outside the sealed window. "We need to preserve this, all of it." Guidry nodded slowly. "I'll call the timber company. Tell them what we found. This isn't our decision to make." The next morning, Martin Boudreau read about the discovery in the Plaquemine Sentinel. The headline read, "Secret Room Discovered in Beaumont Plantation House, Historical Documents Found." Boudreau, now in his 50s and still serving as parish clerk, felt a shock of recognition. The Beaumont Plantation. A sealed room. Documents. He went to the parish archives and found Moses Durant's letter, exactly where it had been filed 26 years earlier. The envelope was yellowed, the wax seal intact. Across the front, in Moses's careful handwriting, "To be opened only when the third-floor room is unsealed." Boudreau broke the seal and read the letter. Read it twice, then a third time, understanding dawning with each reading. He took the letter to the salvage company's temporary office at the plantation. Guidry and his crew had stopped work, waiting for instructions from the timber company about how to proceed. The room had been closed again, this time locked to prevent looters or the merely curious from disturbing the documents. "I have something you need to see," Boudreau said, handing over Moses's letter. Guidry read it aloud so the whole crew could hear. When he finished, there was silence. "So this woman," Tommy said finally, "she locked herself in there, with all those documents, and died in there." "Maybe," Guidry said. "The letter doesn't say for certain. But whether she did or not, she meant for this room to stay sealed for exactly this long. 60 years. Long enough for the people named in the documents to be gone. Long enough for the truth to be history instead of accusation." "What do we do with it?" someone asked. Boudreau cleared his throat. "I've already contacted Louisiana State University. Their history department is very interested. They want to catalog and preserve everything, make it available for research. And the demolition? The timber company agreed to delay it. They're in negotiations now with the State Historical Society about possibly preserving the house, or at least this room. But regardless, the documents will be saved. Over the next 3 months, A team of historians from LSU carefully removed every document from the sealed room. They catalogued, photographed, and preserved each page, thousands of them representing 7 years of meticulous documentation. The Amélie Laurent collection, as it came to be known, was unlike anything in the university's archives. Most historical documents from the Plantation era came from the perspective of owners and overseers, the people who had power and used it to shape the narrative. But Amélie's archive included voices that had been systematically silenced, enslaved workers testifying to their own experiences, documenting their own stories. The historians found Moses Durant's duplicate documents too. Boudreau had remembered them from the letter and suggested they might be buried in the Plantation cemetery. They dug where Moses had indicated and found the waterproof box exactly where he'd left it, its contents still intact after decades underground. The collection was made public in 1928. It caused a sensation. Newspapers across the South ran stories about the secret archive of the Beaumont Plantation. Some papers praised the discovery as important historical documentation. Others condemned it as biased, claiming Amélie had exaggerated or fabricated details. A few plantation families whose ancestors were mentioned in the documents threatened legal action, though nothing came of it. But among historians and researchers, the collection was recognized as extraordinary. Here was evidence of plantation operations documented not from the perspective of justification, but of witness. Here were names and stories that would have been lost otherwise. Here was truth, preserved at great cost. One historian, Dr. Eleanor Hughes of LSU, wrote in her analysis, "The Amélie Laurent collection represents a unique convergence of conscience and courage. Miss Laurent was complicit in the system she documented. She lived in comfort provided by others' suffering. She benefited from structures of oppression even as she recorded them. She never claimed to be a hero or a savior, but she did something crucial. She refused to let the truth be erased. Her archive isn't perfect. It's filtered through her perspective, limited by her access and understanding, shaped by her own guilt and moral struggle. But it's honest in ways that official records of the era almost never are. It names names. It tells stories. It preserves voices that would otherwise be silent. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that even those who benefit from injustice can choose to bear witness against it. Miss Laurent couldn't undo what had been done. She couldn't free the enslaved or give back what had been taken. But she could document the truth and protect it for a future that might be ready to hear it. That she sealed herself away to do this work, that she gave her freedom, and possibly her life, to preserve this evidence, speaks to the weight she felt. She understood that some truths are worth protecting even at great personal cost, especially those truths that powerful people would prefer to forget. The collection remained at LSU, available to researchers. Over the decades, it was used in countless dissertations, books, and documentaries about plantation life, the Civil War era, and Reconstruction. The 43 names on Amélie's list became the subject of genealogical research. Descendants were found, family histories were reconstructed, stories were reclaimed. Moses Durant's letter was framed and displayed alongside the collection, his words a testament to the alliance that had protected the truth. It mattered enough for Miss Amélie to lock herself away. It mattered enough for me to spend decades protecting it. It should matter enough for whoever comes next to at least consider what it means. But one question was never answered. Did Amélie die in that room? When the salvage crew first opened it, they found no body, no bones, no evidence of human remains. The bed was made as if waiting for someone who never came to sleep. The room showed signs of long habitation, but no signs of death. Charles Beaumont's records, found in a separate archive, showed that he'd paid for a burial in 1867 and placed a marker in the family cemetery. But when that grave was exhumed in 1929 during the historical investigation, it was empty. Nothing but Louisiana dirt. Some historians believed Amélie had died in the room and Charles had secretly removed her body, burying it elsewhere to avoid questions. Others thought she'd faked her death, that the stopped eating, the silence, the lack of response had all been performance, and that she'd somehow slipped out of the room and disappeared. A few noted that the sealed room's window, though covered with curtains, wasn't nailed shut. A determined person, working carefully and quietly, could have opened it, climbed down using the gallery columns, and disappeared into the night. The room was high up, but not impossibly so for someone motivated and careful. Moses's letter offered no clarity. He'd written only, "Miss Amelie made her choice." Whether she stayed or left, the room remained sealed. That was the promise, and I kept it. The ambiguity seemed intentional, as if Moses wanted the mystery to remain. Tommy Reeves, the salvage worker who'd first broken through to the room, was interviewed many times over the years about what he'd found. He always described the same scene: papers everywhere, everything organized, the room frozen in time. But he added one detail that never made it into the official reports. "When I first stepped in there," he told a reporter in 1952, "before we started moving things around, I noticed the desk. It was covered with papers, all organized, but right in the center, like it had been placed there specifically for whoever opened the door, there was a single rose, dried, brown, crumbled at the edges. It must have been 60 years old. And next to it, a note that just said, 'Thank you.' Who do you think she was thanking?" the reporter asked. Tommy had shrugged. "Maybe whoever finally opened the door. Maybe Moses Durant for keeping his promise. Maybe all of us for caring enough about the past to preserve it. I don't know. But I kept that rose. Still have it." He'd pulled out a small wooden box from his desk and opened it carefully. Inside, preserved between sheets of wax paper, was a dried rose, brown, fragile, ancient, and a small piece of paper with 2 words written in elegant script: "Thank you." The Beaumont Plantation house was demolished in 1928, despite efforts to preserve it. The cost was too high, the deterioration too advanced. But before it was torn down, the 3rd-floor room was carefully dismantled and reconstructed in the Louisiana State Museum in Baton Rouge. You can visit it there today. The room looks exactly as it did when Tommy Reeves first broke through that sealed door. The narrow bed, the dresser, the wardrobe with faded dresses. The desk is positioned exactly as Amelie left it, though the original papers are now in climate-controlled archives. On the desk is a replica of that dried rose, and next to it, the original note: "Thank you." The museum placard reads, "This room belonged to Amélie Laurent, who lived on the Beaumont Plantation from approximately 1858 to 1867. For reasons that remain partially mysterious, Miss Laurent spent the final years of her life gathering evidence about plantation operations, documenting not the official history, but the lived truth of those who experienced it. In 1867, this room was sealed. It remained sealed for 60 years until 1927, when it was opened during the plantation house's demolition. Inside was found what is now known as the Amélie Laurent collection, the most comprehensive primary source documentation of plantation life from the perspective of those who were enslaved. Whether Miss Laurent died in this room or escaped from it remains unknown. What is known is that she dedicated years of her life to preserving truth at great personal cost. She chose isolation, possibly death, to protect evidence that powerful people would have preferred to destroy. Her archive has been used by historians, genealogists, and descendants to reclaim stories that would otherwise have been lost. The 43 names she documented have become 43 family histories reconstructed, 43 lives remembered. This room is a monument to the power of witness, to the importance of truth-telling, even when truth is dangerous, and to the courage it takes to preserve what others would rather forget. Thousands of people visit the room each year. Some are historians and students. Some are descendants of the people named in Amélie's documents, coming to see where their ancestors' stories were preserved. Some are just curious, drawn by the mystery of the locked room and the woman who chose to seal herself away. All of them stand in that small space and feel the weight of what it represents, a truth that someone cared enough about to protect for 60 years. a witness that refused to be silenced, a reminder that the past doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient, and that sometimes the only way to honor what happened is to remember it honestly, no matter how painful that honesty might be. Outside the museum, in the garden, there's a small memorial. 43 names carved in stone, arranged in alphabetical order. Durant, Philip Durant, Marcus Hewitt, Sarah Pruitt, James Carter, Delphine, and 38 others. People who lived, worked, suffered, and died on the Beaumont plantation. People who might have been forgotten, if not for one woman who decided their stories mattered enough to preserve. At the bottom of the memorial, a quote from Moses Durant's letter: "The truth always matters, even when it takes decades to surface." The Beaumont plantation is gone now. The land was divided and sold, the fields given over to other uses, the bayou still flowing past where the house once stood. But the truth remains, preserved in Amélie Laurent's careful handwriting. Protected for 60 years in a locked room, waiting for the moment when it could finally be told. And in that preservation, in that patient waiting, in that refusal to let the past be erased, there is its own kind of justice. Not perfect, not enough, but something. A door that stayed closed for 60 years has finally opened, and the truth it protected is still speaking, still mattering, still reminding us that some things are worth locking away until the world is ready to hear them.